The order came through at 11:47 on a Tuesday, and the only strange thing about it, at first, was the address. Marco had been driving for 6 hours. The shop closed at 11, but dispatch kept the app running for another 40 minutes to catch the last stragglers, the desperate and the hungry and the people who had simply lost track of time in whatever hollow they inhabited. He knew this city the way men who drive it at night always know it, not by its landmarks, but by its rhythms, its textures, the way certain intersections smelled of rust and standing water, the way the silence after midnight had a particular weight to it, specific to Rust Belt cities, specific to places that had once been loud and had learned gradually to be otherwise. He knew Alderman Street. He knew the grid between Alderman and Corso. He had driven it dozens of times. The two streets, according to every map he had ever consulted, shared a wall at their nearest point, a fact of civic geometry as fixed and unargued as the cold itself. The pin the app dropped was in that wall, not near it, in the negative space that should not exist between two things that touched. He stared at the screen for a long moment. The payment had processed. The order was legitimate. A large pepperoni, a 2-litre, the kind of unremarkable transaction that made up the whole substance of a Tuesday night. He typed the address into 3 separate map applications. 2 of them returned no results. The third produced a pin, confidently placed, and offered him a route that made no coherent sense, routing him past streets he knew did not connect, through an intersection that had been a vacant lot since at least the 1990s. He accepted the order. Later, he would not be able to explain why, or rather, he would explain it in the language of professional obligation, of a man who did not want to eat the cancellation penalty, and he would know, even as he said it, that this was not the truth. The drive was ordinary for the first several minutes. Then the streetlights began to thin. Not in the way they thin when you leave a commercial district. Those transitions have a logic, a comprehensible gradient. This was different. The lights simply became less frequent, and then less bright, and then the gaps between them stretched in a way that did not correspond to the distance he was travelling. His odometer said he had gone 4 blocks. The darkness said otherwise. The radio, which had been cycling through the same 3 songs all evening, went to static somewhere around the second light that shouldn't have been dark. And the static was pure and absolute, the kind that has no texture, no variation, just white noise filling the car like a substance. He switched it off. The silence that replaced it was not better. The city around him was withdrawing. That was the only way he could describe it to himself, though he did not fully put it in those terms while it was happening. Only in the hours afterward, sitting under fluorescent light, hands still not entirely steady. The buildings on either side of the street grew older, more derelict, more vacant. Their windows were dark in the particular way of structures that have been empty for a long time. Not temporarily unoccupied, but hollowed out, the life simply gone from them, as it goes from a face. The GPS recalculated twice. Each new route it offered was shorter, more direct, and more impossible. He stopped consulting it. He was driving on instinct, or on something he was mistaking for instinct. Something that felt like a pull, directional, specific, insistent in the way that a sound at the edge of hearing is insistent, demanding your attention without ever quite resolving into something you can name. He turned onto what the grid insisted was the space between Alderman and Corso, and stopped the car. The lot was empty, cracked asphalt, a chain-link fence along the far edge, a single dead tree tilted at an angle that suggested the earth beneath it had subsided. There was nothing here. There had never been anything here. He knew this lot. He had parked near it once, in daylight, and it had been entirely unremarkable, the kind of urban absence that accumulates in these cities like sediment. The door was standing in the centre of it, freestanding, no frame, no wall, no structure of any kind attached to it, simply a door, solid, wooden, painted a dark color he could not identify in the dimness, standing upright in the cracked lot as if it had always been there. The light beneath the door was warm, amber almost, the kind that comes from somewhere lived in and close, and it had no business existing in the middle of an empty lot in the freezing dark. The corridor beyond the door was longer than the lot it had no right to be standing in, tiled in white that had gone the color of old teeth, lit by fluorescence that buzzed at a frequency that seemed to vibrate not in his ears but somewhere behind them. Marco stood at the threshold for a moment that felt longer than a moment. The professional reflex in him, the same one that had carried him through bad neighborhoods and hostile porches and the particular misery of apartment complexes with broken intercoms, said, "Knock again. Announce yourself. Complete the transaction." But the transaction had already changed its shape. The door had swung inward without resistance, without the creak of hinges, without any of the small mechanical protests that announce the physical world's cooperation. It had simply opened, as if it had been waiting for exactly the weight of his knuckle against its surface. He stepped inside because there was no other coherent action available to him. Or perhaps coherence had ceased to be the operating principle the moment the GPS had gone blank. The insulated bag hung from his right hand. He was still holding it. That fact struck him as almost grotesque. The air in the corridor was cold, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It pressed against the skin of his face with a specific, deliberate quality, like the air in a room that has been sealed for a very long time and resents being disturbed. It smelled of industrial cleaner, the sharp chemical green of it, and beneath that, something older, something that the cleaner had been applied to mask and had not succeeded in masking. Not rot, exactly, not decay in any biological sense, something more fundamental than decay. The smell of a material that had been accumulating whatever it accumulated for longer than the building above it had existed. He walked. The fluorescence above him buzzed in a rhythm that was almost, but not quite, regular. Each flicker seemed calculated rather than mechanical. A pause inserted into the light at intervals that prevented him from settling into the comfort of predictability. The tiles on the walls were set in the standard grid of any institutional corridor, any hospital basement, any school annex built in the decades when function was the only aesthetic consideration. But they were wrong in a way he could feel before he could name. The grout lines did not meet at right angles with the consistency they should have. The ceiling sat at a height that made each step feel slightly too short, as if the space were incrementally compressing without committing to compression. The corridor bent, not sharply, not in any way that would have appeared on a blueprint as an aberration. It bent the way a sentence bends when a word is subtly wrong, a gradual deviation that you register in your body before your mind formulates the objection. The doors began here. They were set into the walls at intervals that had no logic to them, and they were sealed. Not locked, not closed. Sealed, in the way a wound is sealed rather than the way a door is locked. The markings on them were not carved. He looked carefully at the first one, holding his phone's flashlight against the surface, and the marks had no depth. They had not been cut, or etched, or stamped into the metal. They had been put there by a process that had come from inside the metal outward, the way a bruise comes to the surface of skin. Or grown, perhaps. The word that settled in him was grown, and it carried with it a weight of implication he did not allow himself to examine. They pulsed, faintly, in a slow rhythm, at a rate that bore no resemblance to his own heartbeat, and bore every resemblance to something else's. He did not touch them. He was not a reckless man. Whatever compulsion had carried him through the door, it was not the reckless fever of a man who mistakes the absence of visible consequence for the absence of consequence entirely. He was simply moving forward because the corridor offered only forward, because the insulated bag was still warm in his hand and the order was still technically undelivered, and because the part of his mind that generates reasons had not yet surrendered fully to the part that generates dread. The sound reached him before the counter did. A sound like breathing, but slowed to a scale that made breathing the wrong word for it. Each intake was long enough to walk through. Each exhalation pressed against the walls in a way he felt in his sternum, rather than heard with any precision. It was not loud. Loud would have been comprehensible. It was immense. There is a difference between those two things that becomes apparent only in the presence of the latter. The counter appeared at the corridor's next bend. Formica surface, the same institutional beige, a paper ticket dispenser, a small bell of the kind you tap for service. Behind it, a figure in a paper hat, waiting, its back to him, its proportions assembled in the approximate arrangement of a person, in the way that a drawing made from description assembles approximate arrangements without achieving accuracy in any individual detail. The figure behind the counter turned, and its face resolved slowly, the way a shape in fog resolves, and it said, in a voice like something that had learned speech from recordings, "We've been waiting for the order." The receipt was thermal printed, the font the same as every receipt that had ever spooled out of the dispatch printer at the shop, and it was entirely correct, except for the name in the customer field, which was his. Marco stared at it. His full name. Not a customer name that happened to share his first. Not a coincidence to be rationalized away in the cold fluorescent hum of this place. His name, spelled precisely as his mother had spelled it, as it appeared on his license, as it existed nowhere on any order he had ever taken. The timestamp matched, the tip matched. Even the item, one large extra cheese, was correct, and the total $13.47 was a number he recognized from the screen of his own phone. From the dispatch notification he had accepted at 11:47, on a Tuesday in a life that was beginning to feel very far away. He looked up. The figure in the paper hat had not moved. The procedural calm of the exchange was, in its own way, more terrible than any violence could have been. The figure reached across the counter with deliberate, unhurried purpose and placed one hand on the box. It opened the lid. The gesture was not hungry. There was no appetite in it, no eagerness, none of the ordinary human pleasure of a meal. It was the motion of a clerk confirming inventory, of an auditor verifying a column of figures against a ledger. The figure examined the contents with the same expression it had worn before, which was to say, it wore no expression at all, only the vague suggestion of one, the way a reflection in moving water suggests a face without committing to it. It nodded. Once. A single, small confirmation that whatever had been ordered had been correctly delivered, that the terms of some arrangement Marco did not understand had been honored. Then the door behind the counter opened. It did not swing wide. It did not offer itself. It opened perhaps a third of the way, and what lay beyond it was not a kitchen, not a storage room, not any of the utilitarian spaces that should have occupied the rear of an establishment structured like this one. What lay beyond it was dark in the way that the ocean is dark past a certain depth. Not the darkness of an unlit room, but the darkness of a space so vast that light simply fails to survive the crossing. And within that darkness, things moved. Marco could not have said what they were, could not have named their shape, or their number, or their nature, because the darkness withheld that information with something that felt deliberate, almost courteous, as if full disclosure would constitute a cruelty too severe even for this place. What he saw was the suggestion of scale, the way you understand a mountain, not by seeing it whole, but by watching a single cloud move across its face, and realizing how slowly, how impossibly slowly, it travels. He saw one portion of one thing, and his mind made the calculation, and then refused it. The door closed. The figure's hand was already on it before Marco had fully registered what he had seen. and the closure was smooth, quiet, final, a sound like a held breath released. The darkness beyond it was gone as though it had never been offered. The figure turned back to the counter and stood with that same approximate patience, that same quality of something that had learned to perform, waiting without understanding what waiting was for. Marco's hands were still on the box. He became aware of this only slowly, the way you become aware of cold, by increments, by the evidence of your own body, rather than any sudden sensation. His knuckles, he noticed, had gone white. He had made countless deliveries. He had stood in rain, in snow, in the particular hostility of apartment intercom systems that never worked. He had waited on porches, on stoops, in the indifferent wind of parking lots. The transaction was a thing he understood, the fundamental grammar of his working life. Hand over the food, receive the payment, return to the car. Simple, closed, comprehensible. What the figure slid across the counter toward him now was none of those things. It was a key, old, or made to look old, heavy in a way that seemed disproportionate to its size, the way certain objects carry weight that belongs to something other than their mass. It was the kind of object that exists at the center of a story you would never have chosen to enter. The figure placed the key on the counter with a careful, deliberate precision, the way you set down something fragile, and said nothing, and waited, and the door behind it did not open again, but the sound from beyond it, that slow, immense, rhythmic sound, grew very slightly louder. He was back in his car with the key in his jacket pocket before he fully understood that he had decided to take it. His phone was already buzzing with a new dispatch. The key was small, unremarkable, the kind cut from cheap brass that you might receive from a landlord or a storage facility. It should have meant nothing. It had no identifying marks, no tag, no number stamped into its bow, but it sat in his pocket with a weight that felt disproportionate to its size. A density that pressed against his ribs through the jacket fabric as he settled behind the wheel. A man with any sense would have set it on the passenger seat. A man with more than that would have left it on the counter. Marco started the car. The new order was formatted identically to the first. Same app interface, same dispatch header, same confirmation ping. The address populated in the navigation field before he had accepted the job. That was not how the application worked. He registered this wrongness and set it aside the way a man sets aside a thought that arrives too clearly at the wrong moment. He accepted the job. The navigation began recalculating immediately, the route line bending and rebending across the city grid in a way that suggested the software was attempting to reconcile two incompatible things. He had lived in this city for 11 years. He knew the grid the way a sailor knows a coastline, not from maps, but from repetition. From the accumulated memory of 10,000 deliveries. The address the app had produced was not on any street he recognized. More than that, it occupied a position on the map that existed between two known blocks, a gap that should have been a wall. A party wall, the kind of compressed negative space that cities generate between buildings and then forget. The pin sat there with the same unconcerned permanence as the first address had. It pulsed once when he looked at it directly. Though this could have been a screen artifact, though he did not believe it was, the drive out was identical in its degradation. The streetlights did not fail all at once but thinned gradually, the way a crowd thins at the edges of an event, until the intervals between them grew long enough that the darkness between became the dominant condition and the light the exception. His GPS recalculated 3 times in 8 minutes, each iteration routing him through streets that seemed slightly more marginal than the last. As if the city was being peeled back in layers, each one a little older, a little less maintained, a little more uncertain of its own existence. The radio went to static. He had expected this. What he had not anticipated was the character of the static itself, the way it was not uniform but textured, modulated, carrying within it something that resolved almost into pattern, almost into intention. It was the oral equivalent of seeing a shape in fog, the mind insisting on coherence, on the possibility that the noise was organized, that somewhere in the frequency there was a word being repeated, a syllable, a name. He turned the radio off. The silence that followed was no improvement. The parking structure appeared at the end of a service street he did not know. 3 stories of poured concrete, the kind of anonymous municipal structure that exists without being noticed, its signage weathered past legibility. No attendant, no gate arm. The entrance ramp led down into a darkness that the structure's internal lighting was making only a partial attempt to address. He pulled in, parked on the ground level, sat for a moment with his hand still on the wheel, the key in his pocket pressed against his ribs. He took the insulated delivery bag from the back seat, though there was nothing in it. No new order had included a food item, only the address, only the destination. He walked to the elevator. Its doors were already open, the car already waiting, as if it had been summoned by his arrival, or had simply never closed after the last passenger it had carried down. The elevator doors were open and the light inside was the same amber as the light beneath the door in the empty lot. The button panel showed basement levels that no 3-story parking structure should have possessed. The elevator descended past B2 and kept going. The air that pressed in through the gap at the bottom of the doors was cold in the way the vault had been cold. Not weather, not a mechanical failure, but the cold of something vast and still that had been this temperature since long before the building existed. Marco watched the panel. The numbered buttons had stopped at B2. That was the last one listed. Yet the car was still moving, still descending, the cable mechanism above him producing a low, rhythmic groan that had nothing mechanical about it. It was too patient for machinery, too deliberate. The fluorescent strip along the ceiling of the elevator flickered in time with that groan. He had known it from the moment his hand closed around the key in the corridor above. The knowing had done nothing at all to stop him. The doors opened. What lay beyond them was not a level of a parking structure. It was an enormity. The flashlight on his phone pushed maybe 30 feet into it before the dark simply absorbed the beam, the way the island had absorbed sound. Deliberately, as if the darkness here were a considered choice rather than an absence of illumination. The ceiling, if there was a ceiling, was not visible. The floor was concrete, or had been concrete once, but the surface was so densely covered in markings that the original material was almost irrelevant. The symbols ran edge to edge, floor to every wall his light could locate, identical to the ones burned into the corridor doors above. But these were not dormant. They pulsed with a slow, rhythmic luminescence, a cold blue-green that suggested neither fire nor electric. IT, but something older than either. Something that had been pulsing here in the dark since long before anyone had poured the foundation above it. He felt the hum before he heard it. It entered through the soles of his shoes, moved upward through his legs, and settled in his sternum. A vibration so low and persistent it sat at the outermost edge of perception, and yet felt already like something he had always known, like a sound heard in early childhood and only now recalled. The delivery bags were arranged in rows. He counted 30 before the light gave out. There were more beyond the edge of it. He could tell that much. They were from every service. The padded thermal bags, the rigid hard-shell carriers. The simple insulated pouches with Velcro flaps that regional chains had used a decade ago and stopped using. Some of the bags nearest the elevator were familiar brands. Some of them were still warm. He could see it, not feel it, not yet, but see it. The faint shimmer of residual heat rising from the bags in the nearest rows, caught in his flashlight beam, the way heat rises from asphalt in summer. That warmth had no business being here. This cold was not a temperature that left warmth intact. This cold was surgical. It was specific. And yet the warmth persisted in those bags, stubbornly, as if whatever had been placed inside them still carried the memory of an oven, a kitchen, a person who had folded the box closed and set it in a bag and thought nothing about it, except that it needed to get somewhere. Marco moved along the nearest row without deciding to move along it, his flashlight sweeping across the bags in sequence. The precision of the arrangement was the most disturbing thing. Worse than the scale. Worse than the cold. Each bag was placed at an identical distance from the next. Each faced the same direction. There was an intention here that implied ongoing attention. An intelligence that returned to this space and arranged things with the patience of something that had no particular relationship with time. The hum deepened, a single register lower, a shift so subtle that he registered it first as a change in pressure rather than a change in sound. A tightening in his inner ear, a sensation like the moment before a very large bell is struck. He turned his light toward the nearest wall. The symbols covered it entirely, every centimetre from the floor to the height the beam could reach. They were not the same symbols repeating. They burned themselves into his vision the way a pattern does when you stare at it too long. The way a signal travels, the way a message travels, the way something immense turns its attention incrementally from one point to the next. He understood, looking at them, that they were not decorative. They had never been decorative. They were functional in the way the chains in the labyrinth had been functional, in the way the sealed doors in the corridor above had been functional. They were not meant to summon. They were meant to hold. The question that settled in Marco's chest, cold and specific and entirely unwelcome, was what had happened to the thing they had been holding. Whether the answer to that question was somewhere ahead of him in the dark, or whether it was the dark. The symbols on the wall nearest him pulsed once, a single slow contraction. In the brief brightening of their light, he could see his own shadow stretched enormous and wrong behind him, shaped like something other than a man holding a pizza bag. It was in the far corner, and it did not have a shape so much as it had an argument, a persistent, encroaching case, made not in language, but in temperature and pressure, and the slow, specific dimming of every light source Marco had. His flashlight did not go out. It did something worse. It continued to emit light, and the light continued to reach the far corner, and the far corner continued to absorb it with a disdainful, absolute thoroughness, the way the chains in the labyrinth had absorbed every hammer blow, not resisting exactly, but refusing. The presence there was not darkness in any conventional sense. It was the argument that darkness makes. That light is borrowed. That warmth is temporary. That the distance between any 2 points is ultimately unbridgeable. He looked at the delivery bags arranged in their rows. He understood them now. The way you understand a thing when the understanding comes not as thought, but as a cold settling weight behind the sternum. They were intact, every one of them. The thermal bags still zipped, the boxes still sealed, the contents, where he could see them through transparent windows of packaging, still arranged with the careful, fragile optimism of someone who had made food for another person. Nothing had been eaten. Nothing had been taken in any physical sense. And yet they were hollow. The word was not quite right, but no better word existed. Whatever quality makes a meal, the heat that implies a kitchen, the smell that implies intention, the fact of one human preparing sustenance for another human acro, as some small dignified distance, all of that had been extracted, leached out with a terrible patience. What remained were the forms of things. It did not speak. To say it communicated would dignify the process more than it deserved. What it did was erode. Marco felt the edges of his certainty beginning to go soft, the way ice goes soft at the margins before it loses coherence entirely. The thought arrived not from outside him but from some newly hollowed part of him, that the order he had taken at 11:47 on a Tuesday had always been inevitable, that every delivery he had ever made had been a small rehearsal, that the warmth of a pizza box held against the body during a long, cold drive is a gesture, only a gesture, a brief assertion against a universe that is unfathomably large and has no preference for warmth over cold, for arrival over absence, for the person who brings the thing over the thing itself. He was aware that he had taken a step forward. He didn't remember deciding to. The nearest delivery bag was from a service he didn't recognize. The logo faded to near illegibility, the bag itself old in a way that suggested years rather than weeks. Something inside it had once been warm. He could not have said how he knew that, but he knew it with the same chilling certainty with which Elias had known, watching the sigils dim, that the crew was disturbing something that required no invitation and would accept no apology. He understood, with the clarity that comes just before panic or just after it, that the transaction was not completed, that the figure in the paper hat had given him the key because something down here needed not the pizza, but the person who brought it.